Welcome everyone to this What Matters Today special edition podcast at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Jérome Duberry, Managing Director of the Tech Hub, Academic Advisor at Executive Education, and Senior Researcher at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. Today we have four distinguished speakers. I will start with Professor Anna Leander. Professor Anna Leander is Chair of the Department of Political Science, Professor of International Relations and Political Science. She has extinguishedly worked on digital technologies, and we're very pleased to have you today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Next to you, we have Laugier. Laugier is a postdoctoral researcher at the EPFL, the Polytechnical University in Lausanne, and he has been working on different forms of AI since a couple of years, and he will be our computer scientist today at the table. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Leo. Now we have on my left Samuel. So Samuel Smith is a master's student here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He is part of the MINT program, and he's doing an ARP, an applied research project on the accountability of algorithmic surveillance system with Edgeland Institute. And to his left, to my left, we have Anne-Lee Steele from the Alan Turing Institute, who's a researcher, but also a community manager at the Turing Institute, and also moderating or coordinating the Alan Turing Way project. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Samuel, let me turn to you first. The topic today is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is everywhere. It's in the news. We can read every day about ChatGPT. Can you tell me a little bit about how do you use artificial intelligence in your everyday life?
Yeah, absolutely. Artificial intelligence is everywhere, as you've said. So I use artificial intelligence every time I pick up my iPhone and it unlocks with Face ID, I think it's called. But of course, also especially ever since the wave of generative AI has dropped in November of last year. As a student, I've started using all of these new fun or also a little scary AI services. So next to ChatGPT, there's a bunch of other stuff like Otter AI to transcribe all my interviews and get that done quick and easy, or translation programs, DeepL, Grammarly, all of that. Or also, I actually just recently discovered a great new AI tool that is called Consensus App, which fixes the issue of ChatGPT that it doesn't give real papers, but actually it provides you with scientific literature on the questions you have. So, yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. Anne, let me turn to you. How do you use AI in your everyday life?
I found this question really interesting, actually, as someone that, funnily enough, doesn't use a lot of AI-driven tools, at least immediately associating it with something like ChatGPT, because I actually began in trying to think about, my everyday. Where is AI already mundane? Where is it already integrated in my life? So much so that I don't even notice it. And funnily enough, I started thinking about, on one hand, CAPTCHA, the kind of verification systems that we manually use whenever we're trying to, put in our passwords, putting them in correctly, by identifying a correct image, for example, on a web page. That data set is training algorithmic feature detection algorithms, right? And that has been around for more than a decade now. And it's something that we find annoying or kind of frustrating, but it's a part of our everyday lives. And the other one that I was actually thinking about was the Zoom backgrounds that I use for essentially every meeting that I'm a part of now in this post-pandemic landscape. And in order to, create this Zoom background, and in order for me to show up on screen and to move around without having any trouble or a green screen behind me, we're actually using image segmentation that uses computer vision algorithms that separate our bodies from our backgrounds, which means that algorithms are being used every single day when I'm tuned into digital life on Zoom. And that is just like two examples of how it's already become so mundane in my everyday life, but I wouldn't immediately associate them with AI.
Thank you, Anne. Now let me turn to Anna. Anna, do you use AI in your everyday life?
Well, I think so. What Anne and Sam have just said really shows what AI is and how it's deeply entangled with our lives. It's much more than a tool. So let me just be super clear on what I mean by AI. So for me, AI is basically when we place decisions in digital infrastructures. And we do that all phones or computers, they do it all the time. And the reason for that is that the quantities and speed of data transiting makes it necessary to place a lot of really, really banal decisions about should things go right or left, should they be shown or hidden in the technology, which of course needs to be trained by human and so on. But it's basically the decisions are made by algorithms. So every time we turn on our phones, we're basically relying on AI. And to illustrate, so in my field, I'm a security studies scholar. I'm a scholar of international relations and political science, but I specialize on security. And all digital communication is secured. And that security is largely automated. So, which means that, of course, there's someone who writes the program and so on, but, you know, on a very banal level, what's going to be flagged or not, when there's an anomaly or a threat, it's basically done through AI. So I think, we're all, our daily lives, basically, and the ways we see and think and so on are deeply entangled with what we commonly call AI.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Now let's turn to our computer scientist here at the table. What is AI?
What is AI? That's a very difficult question. And I would say that first, I'm not a big fan of the word artificial intelligence. I'm not using it every day because I find it a rather general and a bit vague concept that has been, I think, introduced in the post-war era with the early development of computer science. And I think at the time there was this goal that everyone could perceive, that was to develop an intelligence that was at the level of a human. Now, in the last 70 years, there have been quite a number of development in AI and a growing number of tasks being solved by computers. More and more complex tasks have been solved. Is there a point where we can say that artificial intelligence has been solved? Obviously not. Though computers are way better than us at specific given tasks. In the 90s, when Deep Blue, the chess-playing computer, beat Kasparov, the chess world champion, of course, even if Kasparov was considered to be very intelligent for his mastering of chess, the day Deep Blue beat Kasparov, and the day after that, we didn't say Kasparov is not intelligent anymore, or less intelligent than Deep Blue. Of course, because you could always ask Kasparov to make you a coffee, and it would always be better than what Deep Blue could or could not do. So that's why I prefer mentioning methods, models, or paradigms, like machine learning when I talk about artificial intelligence. Because talking about artificial intelligence, it's talking about intelligence. And talking about intelligence without social scientists, philosophers, neuroscientists is very difficult for me. And my intuition of intelligence is this very human, singular behavior of adapting. Another example, a couple of years ago, we were talking a lot about autonomous vehicles that were an implementation of artificial intelligence. But I remember, I think it was Jean-Gabriel Ganassia that was saying at the time, vehicles will be autonomous, not the day they will drive alone without a human driver, but the day they will know where to pick your child at the school, when you need to go to the doctor, where exactly and when they need to drive you and your parent to a restaurant for their birthday. So that's why it's difficult term. I think there is also the science fiction term artificial intelligence, which refers more to artificial general intelligence that we may mention later.
Thank you, Leo. Could we say that actually to distinguish between what is AI and what is not, we could use two criteria such as autonomy and adaptation or adaptability? Would you agree with that?
I think for defining intelligence, definitely. Artificial intelligence is then the computer, like the machine replication of this behavior. In my thesis, I used a definition that was on Wikipedia to define artificial intelligence. I think it has been edited since then, but it was saying that artificial intelligence corresponds to any computer science system that perceives its environment and takes actions that maximize its chance of achieving its goals. And so we see here that it's really like focusing on goals or a set of goals which can exceed humans. And even like in the 50s, like the first calculators were much better than humans very quickly, though not showing really intelligent adaptation behaviors. So yeah.
Thank you. Anne, do you want to intervene?
Leo makes a really interesting point here that draws upon, I think, a couple of distinguishing factors when we define AI. On one hand, Leo was, talking about the difficulty of defining AI in the first place because one thinks more about computer science practices that enable that to happen. So on one hand, you have kind of like the dream of AI, the notion of AI, the idea of it, the political impetus of it, whatever that may mean. But you have the practice of computer science, of computer vision, of human-computer interaction, of scientific research, mathematics being the foundation of computer science, that really kind of are important to separate because they involve very different actors and very different questions in turn. But something else that you pointed out was also very much tied to the history of computing itself as it fuels the history or the notion of AI, because AI as a term is not necessarily new. It was introduced in a panel whose name I forget, so maybe I should rehearse and redo this answer, at an advanced research program. I believe, what was it called? I can get the exact name, but there was Dartmouth College. The term artificial intelligence was invented at that time during one of the other kind of boom and bust cycles of artificial intelligence as we know it, which began in this kind of rush of the war period, where Alan Turing, on one hand, was inventing the computer in the United Kingdom. You had the Z3, which was being invented in parallel in Germany, as well as the ENIAC machine that was being invented in parallel in the United States. And these were all very securitized, very private projects. But after that, they realized quite quickly that the computing power that they had available to them was not able to keep up with the questions that they were asking the technology to do. And so they had to wait for the hardware, the computational power, to catch up to the questions that they were asking, which only happened maybe 20 years down the line. And so you have this kind of popular notion, which is called Moore's law, which makes this idea concrete, that computation doubles every 10 years. And we find that happening now where, you have this kind of rush, kind of questions that were happening around AI. Post the kind of enigma period, you have like IBM really come into the scene, right? And then no more like funding along those areas. You have different notions of automation that come into play, but then computing accelerates in the 2010s, and now you see this kind of current dream and vision of AI come into play.
Thank you, Anne. At the Institute, we have a number of projects dealing with technology. Actually, technology has been a key research topic at the Geneva Graduate Institute since its inception, since that technology plays such a key role on the international stage. And I really like, Anne, what you're mentioning when you're talking about the questions that technology triggers. Anna, you're talking a lot in your research about power within the design of technology. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. And let me sort of backtrack a little bit to I want to come back as well on what is AI, and, does it have to have emergent properties to be considered artificial intelligence? And that's one definition of it. Like, you think that only the things that, when we say emergent properties, what we mean is that the technology develops itself, basically, so that you write the algorithm such that when it reaches a certain threshold, it will change its own definitions. And of course, these things can then be supervised or unsupervised depending on how important they are, and so on. And that's one way of thinking of it. But even if you go there, we're still in a situation where most of the mundane things in our phones are included. And for this reason, so I just want to sort of point this out. It's super important distinction, actually. And the reason I didn't include that when I was talking in the beginning, and let me be very clear on this, is that I think that the definition that Leo gave is actually excellent. The idea of the algorithms basically having, or the codes having to work at their best in a shifting environment. And the digital environment is very complex, and so it changes all the time and very quickly. So even a simple algorithm that doesn't have emergent properties keep making decisions according to what it was intended to do as best as it possibly can, even if it isn't rewriting itself. So this is the reason why I'm really, while we can go really, really complex and, go into the sci-fi world and, deep neural networks where we try to integrate feelings and the complexities of languages and all the excess of that. So that's like one extreme, and that exists, and it's a very important part of what we do. But we also have these really, really banal things that's just basically yes and no, and where the complexity of the systems make for the adaptability and the sort of intelligence part of the technology. So what I wanted to say about design, so if we think that this is the very mundane things that we use all the time. Everyone has a smartphone. Everyone has a computer. Artificial intelligence is part of basically how that thing operates. Then there's a lot of power and politics designed into that. So when we think about politics, classical definitions revolve around the authoritative distribution of values, or who gets what, how, on what kind of terms. Well, basically, on our computers and on our phones, these artificial intelligence, let's speak that language, although I'm completely with Leo, I don't like it very much, but let's say that because that's what we're talking about here. So artificial intelligence basically make a lot of choices for us about what will be shown, what we'll be seeing, and what we can actually do. Like what's possible to do with this technology. So that's basically like saying yes, the who gets what, when, and how we distribute values, like what kind of values we get to see, what kinds of values are bombarded at us, what kind of reactions we learn about, is really designed into the technology. So it's a hyper political thing. So that's one point. It really, the design, not only of the, ultra complicated networks, but the very sort of basic things on our computers are political. And it matters very much because, as we know in political science, power is never as effective as when you can't see it. So, gendered power, until women start to say, oh, that's really not so normal. Taken for granted things that are established and that people don't contest because they see them as natural are the most powerful. And of course, we don't see the role of artificial intelligence, I speak that language again, in our very mundane technologies through which we do much of our lives. So it's a very, very subtle and actually insidious form of politics and power that really operates through the design, and that operates because we don't problematize it. It also operates a lot. So I keep talking about the move from reason to resonance. The classical image of politics is like the Greek bull. You have two people stand up and they debate and they argue, and it's reason, and the best argument wins, maybe with a bit of pathos and so on. But here we're talking about something quite different. We're talking about basically things that operate on our effective lives and how we basically perceive things without really being conscious of it, in excess of language, beyond language. And so that form of power and politics is really important. And this is why I've been working on design. And you're completely right, Jérome. So thanks for asking me the question. I think the design of technology, including AI, is super important. Thanks a lot for asking.
Thank you, Anna. Samuel, let me now turn to you. You are part of an applied research project with Edgeland Institute on the accountability of algorithmic surveillance. Based on that perspective, what do you have to say about this design, this notion of power and AI?
I mean, first of all, I'd say that one thing that makes AI or technology so inherently political is based on what you've said, Anna, is how the values that are packed into a technology. And so in algorithmic surveillance, for example, we see that there are all these trade-offs that have to be dealt with when it comes to AI, like a country, a state wants to provide security to its citizens, but at the same time also wants to maintain their privacy, their freedom of expression and all that. So there are all these trade-offs that have to be dealt with and have to be decided on, which then end up baking in all these very inherent values into AI. And I mean, I think that will maybe pop up when we talk about governance, but the question of what values we should hold AI accountable to, or algorithms in general, is a very interesting topic, because right now I think we're seeing kind of a shift from older values like human rights, for example, to this new field of AI ethics, where we're talking about these AI ethical values like transparency, accountability, privacy, and all that. So I think that's a very interesting debate that we're seeing right now in the political space.
Thank you, Samuel. We'll come back to this question of governance and ethics and also human rights. But now I'm turning to Leo. We cannot talk about AI without talking about ChatGPT. So Leo, what is ChatGPT?
So before answering to this question, I will make a little transition with the definition of artificial intelligence and specify that the current artificial intelligence revolution is very anchored in the machine learning revolution.
So maybe can you tell us what is machine learning?
Yeah, definitely. Machine learning is a paradigm that is different from the previous methods in artificial intelligence, which relied on what is called symbolic artificial intelligence, with rules specified by experts. Think of learning a language. At school, you take grammar classes, right? But you don't wait primary school to speak, to understand your mother tongue. And this is because, there are several reasons. Maybe some things are pre-encoded in our brain when we get born, but the thing is, when you hear many examples of your environment, so your family talking to you in your mother tongue, you start to develop a model which is a statistical model of words going together, and it makes sense progressively. And that's a little bit the same idea with machine learning, which is often called statistical learning, to draw these to learn statistical patterns right from the raw data. And think of it, a machine capable of learning could quickly appear as intelligent. But if you think of a cat learning something, learning that if it has a behavior, it will receive food, it will learn something without showing intelligence as we understand it for humans. And that's the same thing with machine learning. And more specifically, the last decade, there was a revolution in the machine learning revolution, which was the deep learning revolution. And the basic idea was to design computing models replicating phenomena observed in the biological brain. So we have neurons, many neurons interacting with each other, having each a tiny role in this beautiful brain, and built with layers. So if you think of images that we see through lights. It enters our optic nerve. It is treated by several layers up until the last layers that are the most complex layers that will interpret the image. So the first layer will recognize shapes and then maybe parts of a face, and the last layers will recognize if it's your father, your mother, or someone else. So these methods have been implemented through artificial neural networks and have quickly shown very good results once the computing power enabled large and deep model, hence the deep learning revolution. So people trained model, meaning they rewarded these models and they updated the numerical values inside these artificial neurons with different tasks. ChatGPT is one of these artificial neural networks. More specifically, we say it's a large neural-based language model. So we saw the neural part. Now it's a language model. What does it mean? Well, all happens in the training phase. And the goal is to train the model by giving it a lot of text, actually text coming from all over the web, masking some part of the text, and making the model predict the masked words. You could think of an example where an alien coming from outside Earth would come here. So it's an intelligent being, but without knowing anything about our language or our world. And a human would give to this alien, let's say, Wikipedia in English, with all the words existing in English. So we call it a vocabulary. And then the alien will play a little game. So it will be shown or prompted with parts of sentences of Wikipedia, but truncated sentences. So we remove the last word. And then we ask the alien to fill with the vocabulary the blank with the right word. So in the very first learning step, the alien will probably use random words. So the human here gives some signal to the alien saying, oh no, you were wrong, probably at the beginning. That was the correct and the right word that you should have guessed. And progressively, iteratively, the alien will learn to fill in with the correct word. And along with this process, quickly the alien will learn to understand the language, to generate, so to speak the language, as well as a representation of the word as described on Wikipedia. So if at some point the alien learned to complete the text, Paris is the capital of, with the word Paris, well, it learned a fact. It learned that it's Paris, it's not Berlin. It's Paris, is not football, which doesn't make sense here. Even without specifying the rules behind language, behind our world, and so on, the alien eventually would have learned maybe these rules or some subsets of our worlds. And ChatGPT basically does that with a huge number of parameters.
Thank you, Leo. Building on the alien story, Anna, the relation of power within ChatGPT, what does it make you feel? Or what do you want to add on?
I don't know about the relation of power in ChatGPT, but I find it actually, thanks for spelling out the process of statistical learning and the power relations. Let me just say something, like build on that. And I'm sorry, I can't connect that to ChatGPT because I just don't know. But the general mechanism that is implied in this. So when you have statistical learning, and you train artificial intelligence to do things, you need basically you train it to look for things that work in similar fashion. So you work through homophilia or something like that. Like you create network neighborhoods that sort of makes it possible for it to recognize Paris or whatever, but also to recognize things it doesn't want included. So there's both the process of, what it wants included in that sentence and everything that's going to be excluded. And this is quite interesting because, of course, it means when we say exclusion and inclusion, the basic power mechanism, who is part, what is part of something and what is not. And we often want, for example, so let me just two things, like big discussions, racism in AI, the ways in which, the things were shown and not shown and so on, the statistical logic of producing similarity, of course, means that some things are systematically excluded. And for a long time, that was race. But of course, you can then try to train differently so that you include race and you create homophilia. But you tend to get this logic of basically constructing different neighborhoods. And that has been a very sort of fundamental design problem. And it's part, of course, of what all the big platforms think about. They all have measures. They all have designers who try to find solutions to this, how to make it less racist, how to make it less... they're not doing very well. But anyway, they're working on it, and they're probably doing better than anyone else. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And so the alien story, who do we make an alien of AI? Basically really important. And then there's another alien story that I sort of smirked on, because training, of course, isn't all automatic. You have a huge labor force, largely invisible, cheap labor, Syrians in Germany, whatever, Kenyans. There's a court case now in Kenya about people who are sort of put to train AI to basically try to, one of the core problems is you want some things not to be shown, horrible things, pedophilia, sexuality, violence, etc., etc. But someone needs to teach the AI that it shouldn't show that, and that can't happen magically. So, the process that Leo was sort of laying out for us about saying, okay, so Wikipedia would need to say, this is the wrong answer, that's the right answer. Well, someone needs to do that. And that's this alien, invisible labor that's terribly badly paid, and sort of an interesting underworld of the construction of more inclusive neighborhoods and more exclusive neighborhoods, so to speak, with AI and what's being shown to us. I just wanted to put that in there with the excuse of alien. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. There is actually an excellent documentary called The Cleaners that actually presents this reality or shows this reality. Samuel.
I actually had a question for you, Leo, because one debate that we're always talking about when it comes to ChatGPT is what does it understand and what does it know? Because like in your example, we're dealing with an intelligent alien that somehow managed to come here to Earth, so it must be very intelligent. So after having learned the entire Wikipedia, does it know what France is? Does it know that Paris is a capital and a city and that it is the capital of France? Does it know that? Because one term that we've been hearing a lot lately is the term of a stochastic parrot, I think. So ChatGPT basically just predicting in percentages what could be the most probable next word without having any idea. So does it know anything? Can we say that it knows that Paris is the capital of France, or is it just predicting the words?
It definitely is predicting the word. Somewhere in its parameters is encoded probably this relation, but it's not that clear. And definitely the main criticism is that there is no reason that it learned these rules, that it hard-coded the rules. So before ChatGPT, it was obvious that these models could not learn by themselves rules. I can give an example. And like, as a reminder, correlation doesn't imply causality, of course. And if the model is trained on Wikipedia, and if Wikipedia has the majority of its pages about scientists talking about male scientists, the model will probably learn that it's less probable for a woman to be a scientist. But of course, it would be absurd for a human to encode a rule that women can't do science.
But
At
we've
least
done
nowadays.
that.
By the past.
Yeah, but I mean, still now there are tests where you ask someone, think about a scientist, and most people will think about a man, because we've also been trained on data that we've received all our lives. And in my training data, scientists are usually men.
Yeah, but if I ask you if a woman or a man would be more fit to solve this very specific equation, it's hard to say that a man would be more fit because...
Completely agree, yes.
It's more probable that if I randomly ask people in the population to solve this equation, the right answers might be given by men, because statistically they are more trained with math and science, and we can explain that. But there is no a priori reason that men can solve it better than women.
Would I be able to jump in here for a second?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I think you all are illustrating, I think, maybe what I can do as an anthropologist by training is like take out some of those underlying threads here. Because I think in many ways we're almost talking about very different aspects. And I'm so glad you mentioned parrots, because it gives me the opportunity to plug some work that's being done around this. Leo, you gave a really great explanation of how the process of training can be divided into the data collection period, which we usually associate with the scraping of information from the web, for example. And then it goes into the model training period, this kind of iterative process where binary decisions are ultimately made at the micro level, as you were saying, Anna. And then we have the kind of model deployment in the world, right? Which is like a question of politics, a question of implementation that involves different actors. And their power looks very different at each one of these levels. Because on the model creation side of things, the data collection side of things, you have essentially the training of these models based off of what currently exists. And what currently exists, and what these models are being trained off of is biased, because that is what the development of internet technology looks like. You gave a great example in the use of Wikipedia. Wikipedia has a huge gender problem and it's a very, very turfy space, for lack of a better phrase, where people have certain subjects that they've been working on for years, and they will control the narrative in that language and that space on the subject of Renaissance literature. And you'll have essentially the history of Renaissance literature written by one guy in one place that everyone reads, given the kind of extension of Wikipedia as a project. And this happens across all the languages that exist, excluding even the language problem of whether large language models work outside of the English language in the first place. And so people who have asked that question of bias, has really brought about really interesting projects that have tried to untangle these questions of power. But one of them that's come out of that is really the question of, are large language models too big? And that's where the work of folks like Timnit Gebru, who was fired from Google for writing about ethical AI and really critiquing the work of her own space, the work of Megan Mitchell, now at another counter project called Hugging Face comes into play here. And they wrote the paper on the danger of stochastic parrots. Can large language models be too big? Which asks and begs that really kind of difficult question here. And then, of course, though, on the second part of that, the model training process, you also have people that are trying to ask questions, right? Trying to ask questions of, when these decision-making processes are ultimately binary to an extent, what design choices can you introduce that change how that happens? If you separate model training from a yes or a no into further micro decisions of, what other factors could be identified here that allow you to kind of understand perhaps more nuanced ideas of what is contained in that data that will make it, perhaps, we're definitely not there. That process is happening right now, but so much of those critiques around model training are actually really tied to model deployment and essentially the funding bodies, the political bodies that are having massive amounts of influence in what type of research is being done and who is able to build these systems in the first place, really. OpenAI and ChatGPT, to come full circle, being an example of this. OpenAI is perhaps the most visible example of a massive project that has been funded on a massive scale that received over $1 billion from Microsoft, which, interestingly enough, has its own very particular history and relationship with the development of AI in the first place, in multiple ways. But they kind of dominate the discourse. They dominate the discourse because they receive all of the funding. So of course they were eventually going to create something that was better than anything else that anyone else has on the market. But for example, when you think about a group like Hugging Face, to give you an example, that are really asking questions of, can people opt into data and putting their data into these training sets in the first place? They don't have that kind of resources to do that on the kind of mass level that you get when you have access to the amount of money that countries have for their entire GDP. And so maybe when we ask this question of who has power in the development of AI, we can ask these questions absolutely on the micro level of, how is the data collected, how is the model trained, and how is the model deployed in the world. We can also ask who is enabling what we prioritize in those three phases in the first place, and who are the actors involved in that process. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. Anna, do you want to jump in, contribute to this line of conversation?
Well, we're now into the sort of part. I wanted to, let me backtrack a little bit and say something, and because now we moved into, how we can resist this and what the options are for, diminishing the problems of, for example, racism or exclusions that are built into the design of digital technologies. I just wanted to come back to an important question. So back to the discussion about, Sam asked, does it really know? And I think it's a very important question. And if we think about the reasons for the discrimination and the way that things work in technology and AI, we actually don't really know what it means to know, right? And one of the things definitely it doesn't know so far, and maybe that might change in the future, and people are very optimistic, but it doesn't have cultural sensibilities. So it doesn't, unlike us, if someone asked you, do you think a woman scientist would be less likely? Of course, we have all heard that. We all live in the contemporary world, so we all know that, of course, we shouldn't say that, no, it will be a man. In that sense, the data is, the technology is a little bit stupid. It sort of takes statistically it's true. So the larger the data set, the more it will be true that actually the man is more likely. So when you train, and this is why the issues that you were bringing up, Anne, are so important about what data we train on. But basically, most data sets are pretty racist and pretty misogynist and pretty actually awful. So every time you try to improve this, you tend to get the sort of TieBot Microsoft launched a long time, maybe 20 years ago or something. I don't know how long it is. But anyway, a long time ago, tried this sort of speed that we was launched and automated speech thing that became so racist that they had to take it down within 2 days because basically, it became worse and worse. Now, this really matters. We do a lot of things. It's getting better. So this was a long time ago and things are getting better, but they're not very good. Let's put it like this problem of, producing basically, lacking social sensibilities and therefore reproducing what's actually there in the data in the worst version keeps being true. And this matters because it feeds forward. So it's not only it's bad because it does it then, but it feeds forward because it informs what we then see and what we then think about and so on and so forth. So it's not only about how we see the past, it's also about how we think of the future because the technologies, your computers, your phone, etc., it's all part of our lives. And I wanted to make those 2 points because I think they're pretty important and basic and sort of underlie why we care about the data on which things are being trained and why it matters that we think carefully about what's included and excluded and how we allow that data to feed into basically I'll say the word again, but it's not what I mean. But anyway, the artificial intelligence that then sort of guides us forwards and, makes possible or not the resistance. And let's come back to the other issues. I don't know. Now I spoke a lot. I just wanted to make those two basic points. But I think the points about funding and the market in this really matter. And I would like to come back to those as well, but not right now.
I will give you. I'll come back to you, but I just wanted to Leo to come back to you as well. We're talking about data used in the design of AI and training. What are the challenges to make to avoid the challenges that or the issue that were mentioned until now to make sure that AI doesn't increase the existing social discrimination? And so when you're in the design or developing phase, what's happening?
So historically, with statistical learning, the statistics part was important. And so we needed a lot of data to have a model learning something. It's less and less true with the recent developments. Since models are able, with smaller data sets, to learn what we want them to learn and what we want to teach to them. So it's unclear yet. I think we're really maybe changing paradigm and going to this low data regime. So there was this trade-off historically. Either you have a large amount of data, but probably uncleaned and the quality was low, and of course, all the problems you mentioned, or having a rather small data set, clean, labeled by human experts that knew exactly what were the challenges, the pitfalls, and so on. So ideally, we would have models that could adapt and correct themselves. I think one of the important method behind ChatGPT was this human reinforcement learning, which was a way to align the model more with human expectations of such a model. So yeah, it's definitely crucial to have good data for training models, for fine-tuning models, so if we want to train further. And it definitely requires quality in data, which is not obvious when you scrap the web. Because if you do that, you will eventually have an image of the world, but very biased and very dependent on the way you scrap the data on the data source, rather than if you cleanly filter out and manually annotate data points, there is hope that the model will be improved on what you want to teach it.
Thank you, Leo.
Maybe
Samuel?
just to give an example of what you said about how little data is necessary. I think recently there was a text-to-speech generator that came out that was able to reproduce anyone's voice based on, I think, a 5-second clip of their voice. So down from thousands of hours down to 5 seconds. So I don't know, that I think that's fascinating. And then the other thing on the data issue, I think one issue that we're seeing is that OpenAI or a lot of these tech companies say, well, we need more and more data because with more data, we get more accurate models. I mean, with GPT-3 and 4, I don't know the numbers exactly, but they exploded the data set that was put into train. And so but I do wonder, and I hesitate to think, is that really the solution? Is that really the silver bullet to make all of these models better by just giving it more and more and more and more data? Does that solve anything, or does that just reproduce the same biases as it has done before? No answer to that, but I don't know.
I think it's an open research question, and probably the answer is both. We need currently models are pre-trained in the way I described earlier, so unsupervisedly, so they just try to guess words that were masked, and then they can be fine-tuned with a strong supervision, so a human giving high-level labels on text snippets, in that way you can imagine that you increase the data of the pre-training phase, data size of the pre-training phase, while having high quality fine-tuning data. All sorts of combinations are possible, and I think it's a very trendy, hot, and open research topic.
So Anne, let me turn to you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the open source communities and how do they organize? What are their history maybe, and what are your key takeaways when it comes to these different forms of organizing, governing, designing?
When thinking about this question, I almost struggled to think about and equate open source with the resistance, so to speak, in the sense that open is such, and the term open source is so broadly used, everyone's kind of throwing it around these days, that we forget that it has a much, much longer history that will tie into, I think, all of the questions that you all have introduced. Open source as a mechanism actually has deep roots in intellectual property law and copyright that came along with the kind of unbundling of the mainframe that happened when computers became more widely available, when hardware was separated from software, which was separated from services, and hackers were sharing their software with each other in order to kind of prevent corporate capture of the market and the kind of rebundling of all of these things to be sold to the consumer. And so as these hacker networks kind of grew and were sharing more and more software, the free software movement, as it was called at the time, became this mechanism to kind of share this technology. And it was actually the notion of open source, which emerged in the 1990s, from this question of, when we talk about free, does that necessarily mean that we can capitalize or sell or be open for business cases in the use of open source software? And so that's where the term open source came around. And so if you're deep in the weeds, the way in which we denote this kind of cultural schism between the free software movement and the open source software movement is F/OSS. That remains to this day. And so it's funny to see how open source, in the time since then, alongside this growth in the capacity for computation, a lot of open platforms that allow for the sharing of code, such as GitHub, which you may know of, really we're able to see that kind of take on more of kind of the public attention, right? Open source becomes almost universally the term that we use now, more broadly, because of their ability to because of its openness to the marketplace. And so the reason why I bring this up is because open source has always had this kind of schism between its relationship to corporate actors and to its kind of foundation in the free software movement, which was much more based in this communalism, sharing of knowledge and information. And it's actually the open source movement which spawned all of the other open movements that we think of, like open access, which scholars have been a part of, open government, which government policymakers have been a part of. Open AI being, interestingly, indeed started as an open project, right? But then closed their project when they received $1 billion from more than $1 billion from Microsoft. Microsoft, funnily enough, which also owns GitHub as a platform, the largest code repository in the world, which will soon train the largest code version of ChatGPT. But despite this explosion of open source and this kind of, in many ways, delusion of what open means in the first place, open for whom and open for what being the kind of core question here, there are groups that are thinking perhaps more maybe ideologically on the free side of things that offer an alternative to the systems that we know of. There are many collectives coming from on one hand, the computational arts, which interestingly enough, in this time when anything associated with AI is now receiving funding, you have computational arts communities that may not be as perhaps motivated by notions of profit, are able to kind of experiment and be playful with this technology. That's where these ideas of face paint that allows you to be undetectable by computer vision algorithms have come into play, that in turn improve the scientific research and the computational processes that may perhaps make face detection algorithms less biased, for example. On the other hand, indeed, make it easier for us to be surveilled. But you also have projects like the Data Justice Network by Yasmin Boudelaf. You have feminist data sets by Carolyn Sinders. Many folks that are able to ask and really playing with the technology. Even this notion of, can you hack a data set? Can you add rogue commas, apologies to the computer scientists, that would, break a model on purpose so that it can't be used in the case of so that it can't be implemented, for example, in what could be a very biased context. So people are really hacking these systems too, and it's happening all the time. On the other hand, you also have, projects like I'd mentioned Hugging Face earlier today, a French company that is really reimagining the technical process of machine learning in and of itself. And interestingly enough, I think having now worked with data scientists and of all kinds from many different disciplines, whenever we ask these questions of like, okay, how do you make it ethical? How can we address this question of bias? They're going, my dudes, I'm the computer scientist. I have the data, but what power do I have in its implementation? And what power do I have to like improve that data set that I'm scraping from the web? And what a project like Hugging Face, interestingly enough, is kind of doing is also creating a community around these questions and asking in real time, can we, instead of scraping, can it be something else? Can we ask permission? Instead of, asking, is a model biased or not? Can we, add context through something like a model card or a data card? Can we add openness in a real and like public engagement kind of way, really try to create technical implementations, however imperfect, into the process? Because I think so many of us that are kind of in the wider context and in the wider environment that are asking the bigger questions of, let's make this better, let's make this more ethical, let's make this more responsible, often falter when thinking about its technical implementation. And so it creates this kind of dual burden of responsibility on the computer scientists who may not necessarily have that kind of power, going back to the question of power, but in many ways are asked to hold all of the responsibility of making a more ethical kind of AI, when it's actually a much, much bigger problem. And to even go back to the question of who is being funded, I would say that that's actually really core, because, if the size of a data set doesn't necessarily matter, if we can train on smaller, perhaps more diverse data sets, can we pay people to be those data sets? Can we pay people, instead of these kind of precarious labor environments that you were saying, of data cleaners that are extended all around the world, can we make that process of training a model, of evaluating a model, be something that is actually a job? A kind of like institutionalized form of involvement within this kind of what we continue to view as a kind of black box. Because there are people that are doing so, but that discussion often gets lost amidst the wider, broader, philosophical, deeply important, but often more abstract ones from the on-the-ground, real-time questions of what do I do in XYZ context? And so there are people that are working in these ways, and a lot of them come from the kind of free software and open source software movement. But the question of who sees them, who's visible, and who gives them real resources to do their work is another question entirely.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was very illuminating and thought-provoking. Leo, does this resonate with you?
Yes, it absolutely resonates with me, and I absolutely share what you said about the open source community and these models. Of course, every day we use Hugging Face as the main platform for open source research, for improving these models, for as well investigating these models and benchmarking them. It also raises ethical concerns for very specific tasks. During my PhD, I've been developing a system that tried to rephrase offensive comments, to detoxify online posts. And with the learning technique, it was also possible to learn the reverse. So it raised many ethical concerns that, like, could someone use this open source model as a way of intentionally toxifying the web or social media, or also use it as a censorship system? So for that, computer scientists develop their models. They do computer science, which is a formal science based on mathematical principles. On the other hand, from my understanding, ethics, moral values are subjective and best handled and carefully mastered by social scientists and people working in humanities in general. And it's, I think, crucial to have this effort of bringing people with different backgrounds, different methods, different ideas together to raise new ideas. And all sorts of professions could be involved, journalists, etc. And maybe a final word would be to insist as well on education. I think it's very important to demystify the models. I know it can be scary at first glance, but yeah, the more we can explain what these models do, how they do, what we lack in the understanding of how they process data and produce data, their limitations, is always beneficial. And and today I think was a good example of this kind of session where we are together discussing these topics. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Leo, and we're very happy to have this transdisciplinary discussion, as we have transdisciplinary research also here at the Institute, and so teaching on these topics. Anna, maybe your final words, maybe some comments about governance?
Yes, super quickly, let me chime in with Leo and say I think this is exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having. And on a critical note, I think we really, as social scientists and people working in the humanities, we've let actually a lot of the developers and coders down by basically placing all the responsibility on them, where in fact I think we need to collaborate much more closely around the political and ethical issues that AI poses. And it's unfair to basically just send a reading list to really busy people and say, get updated. It doesn't work. So we need to actually have conversations and collaborate so that we can work in our respective fields where we actually have competence. And we would like to think we have a little bit of that on all sides. Okay, and for that, so that's I chime in, thank you for organizing this. For that to happen, we need conditions of possibility, which means a rethinking of careers, both in engineering and data sciences and in the social sciences and the humanities, and do more of the kinds of interdisciplinary work that this institute is beginning to open up for, but that really needs to go much, much further. And that involves rethinking career and promotion criteria in ways that make it possible to actually get promoted if you publish interdisciplinary research, get a job if you do interdisciplinary research, etc. So this is really a very sort of important political governance of knowledge question that is absolutely necessary, and this is going to be my last point, to come to terms with the really fundamental so I'm a political scientist. I'm going to say political, but I could say ethical ways in which AI is entangled with our everyday lives and our ways of thinking and living and so on. And we need to actually take that both possibility and challenge seriously, and to govern it, to try to, just as we govern other forms of life, and develop ways of thinking about it, not only in terms of laws, but of course laws matter, but also in terms of what would we actually, how do we understand this, and where would we like to take it. So thank you very much, Jérome. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Samuel, your final words?
I think to be able to do all of that you've said, Anna, it seems that we're moving at a too fast pace at the moment. And so it might be, I mean, as this podcast has shown for the listeners that are still here at this moment, it takes an hour to discuss very basic things about what is AI. And it will take thousands of hours to discuss what kind of values we want in them and how we want to regulate them. So we need to find a way to either speed up regulation or slow down technology. Maybe there's a golden third, but yeah, I think we have some challenges ahead.
Thank you, Samuel. I'll jump in to avoid the conversation to restart, but that's a really good point. Anne, your final words?
I'll try to, funnily enough, I think my future predictions or hopes are tied to all three of you in different ways. On one hand, absolutely more interdisciplinary work is needed that brings together the expertise of these different parties, and that is where academic research really needs to find its focus, especially in such an emergent space like AI. But we also need more, on one hand, translation of that work in a public arena alongside investigative work into who pulls the levers of power behind them. And this needs to be something that, like, we in the academy or we in research institutions or we in civil society cannot forget that the discussion that we are having here is so far removed from what people actually understand something like AI to be. Having captured the imagination almost exclusively translates into ChatGPT now. And everything surrounding that is really just, I put something into ChatGPT and it gives me back the answer I'm looking for. And we see that in the way that children will ask, really complicated questions of ChatGPT, treating it like Google now. Like, we're entering a space where public discourse is almost complete, and public understanding of these technologies is so far removed from what we're able to talk about that they're really at a risk of completely diverging. And I really view that kind of alongside interdisciplinary conversation that will advance, public knowledge, discussion, and improvement of these systems to really cry for public translation of them as well, because otherwise we run the risk of almost being completely unhinged or divorced from each other, and to know who we're accountable to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. Thank you all for this very interesting discussion. If you want to find out more about what we do at the Institute in terms of teaching and research, please visit our website, graduateinstitute.ch, or find us on social media platforms. Thank you very much.